Winter did not arrive at the little house on Chiswick Lane so much as move in, unpacking its cold into every corner, as though it meant to stay for good. It came down the chimney and settled in the grate the fire could no longer fill. It pressed its grey face to the windows and breathed frost across the glass, and it took the 2 rooms that Eleanor Hale could still afford to heat and made them into one, and then made that one smaller. There had been a time, not so many years before, when the Hale household had counted its blessings in candles and coal and roast on a Sunday, when her father's study had smelled of pipe smoke and old paper and the low, pleasant murmur of a man content with his lot. That time had gone the way of all quiet comforts, slowly and then all at once. First the illness that ate the savings, then the debts that ate the house, and last of all the funeral that ate whatever dignity a genteel family had left to spend. Now there was Eleanor, and there was the cold, and there was the pianoforte her mother had left her, which she could not sell, because to sell it would have been to sell the sound of her mother's hands, and there was very little else. Fewer logs for the fire, fewer candles by which to read, fewer pleasantries with the landlady, who had begun to look at Eleanor the way one looks at a debt that has not yet come due but soon will. Eleanor endured it the way she endured most things, which was quietly and without complaint, and in a plain grey wool dress that had been turned twice and would be turned again before she permitted herself to think of another. She wore grey because grey did not show its wear, and because grey asked nothing of the world, and because a woman of 24, with no fortune and no family and no prospects, had learned that it was safer to ask for nothing than to ask for something and be refused. She was not a beauty, or so she had been told often enough to believe it, and she had stopped minding. She had a plain oval face, and dark hair pinned without ornament, and grey eyes that missed very little, and she had 2 hands that could make a pianoforte weep or laugh as she chose, and she had a stubborn, unshowy competence that had kept her fed through a season no one thought she would survive. In the mornings, she gave lessons to the daughters of the town's better families, 3 shillings the hour when she could get it, and she was good, patient in a way that made frightened children unfrighten themselves, and firm in a way that made spoiled ones forget to be spoiled. But the better families of a small town are a shallow well, and the well was running dry, and Eleanor had begun to count her remaining coins the way a sailor counts his water. She did not despair. Despair was a luxury, like coal, and she could afford neither. Instead, she made a small economy of hope, spending it carefully, a little each day, on the plain conviction that she was worth something, even if no one had yet found the use of her. In the evenings, when the last lesson was given and the last child sent home, she would sit at the pianoforte in the fading light, and she would play, not for anyone, not for coin, only for the pleasure of hearing something beautiful, in a room that had forgotten how. Her mother's music lay open on the stand, the ink browning at the edges, the pages soft as cloth from handling, and Eleanor knew every note without looking. She played the slow, melancholy airs her mother had loved, and she played them the way her mother had taught her, which was to let the silences between the notes matter as much as the notes themselves. And when she played, she was not poor, and she was not cold, and she was not alone. She was simply a woman, with her hands full of something that could not be taken from her. The landlady, passing in the corridor, would sometimes pause to listen, and would then move on, saying nothing, because there are some things even a hard woman will not interrupt. So the winter deepened, and the town grew quiet under its snow, and Eleanor Hale went on, day by narrow day, teaching and enduring, and playing to an empty room, asking nothing, expecting nothing, holding her small dignity the way one holds a candle in a wind, cupping it close, turning her back to the draught, keeping it lit. She did not know, could not have known, that on a great cold estate some 40 miles to the north, in a house that had also forgotten how to hear anything beautiful, a letter was being written that would carry her name out of that narrow room and into a world she had never imagined and would not have dared to want. The letter came on a Tuesday, delivered by a coachman whose livery was too fine for Chiswick Lane, and who looked at the little house as though it might soil his boots. It was addressed in a hand Eleanor did not know, a firm, slanting hand pressed hard into the paper, and it bore a seal she did not recognize, a raven with its wings half spread, and it was heavy in her palm, in the way that important things are heavy, weighted with more than paper. She turned it over twice before she opened it, and when she opened it she read it 3 times before she believed it, and even then she did not quite believe it. The letter was from a Mrs. Price, housekeeper to His Grace the Duke of Renmore, and it inquired, with the stiff economy of a household that did not waste words on the unimportant, whether Miss Hale would consider a position as music instructress and companion to a young lady of the Duke's household, one Miss Sophia, aged 7 years, the Duke's ward and orphaned niece. The terms were named, and the terms were extraordinary. They were more, for a single quarter, than Eleanor had earned in the whole of the past year. There was mention of lodging, of board, of a fire in her own room, and Eleanor read that phrase again, and felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a long while, a small, dangerous flutter that she recognized, after a moment, as hope, and she put the letter down as though it had grown warm. She could not think how such a letter had found her. She had no connection to any duke, no acquaintance who moved in such circles, no reason at all to have been chosen out of the wide, anonymous world of poor gentlewomen who could play a little and teach a little, and would be grateful for a warm room. And yet here was her name, spelled correctly, and here was the raven pressing its dark wings into the wax, and here was the coachman waiting in the lane for her answer, with the air of a man who had been told not to return without one. She asked him, because she had to ask someone, how it was that His Grace had come to hear of her, and the coachman, who had not been paid to converse, thawed only enough to say that the old lady had had something to do with it, the Duke's great-aunt, Lady Augusta, who had passed through the town in the autumn, and had, it seemed, heard a certain music instructress spoken of, and had heard, perhaps, that same instructress play. Eleanor remembered then a formidable old woman in black, who had sat at the back of the assembly rooms one grey afternoon while Eleanor performed for a paltry fee, an old woman with a lorgnette and a face like a closed door, who had watched her the whole time and said not a word and left before the end. She had thought nothing of it. One did not think much, in Eleanor's position, about the strangers who watched and left. But the old woman had thought something, evidently, and the something had travelled 40 miles north to a great cold house, and had come back again in the form of this impossible letter, and Eleanor stood in her narrow doorway, with the wind pulling at her grey skirts, and understood that she had come to one of those rare doors that a life does not offer twice. She thought of the child. That was the thing that decided her. In the end, not the money, though the money was salvation, and not the fire in her own room, though she had been cold for so long that the promise of warmth was almost too much to hold. It was the single plain word orphaned, and the age 7, and the fact that no letter had troubled to explain why a girl of 7 should need a companion as well as an instructress, which told Eleanor more than a page of explanation could have. A child of 7 who needed a companion was a child who was alone in a house full of people. Eleanor knew a great deal about being alone in a place that ought to have been a home. She went inside, and she trimmed her one good pen, and she wrote her acceptance in a hand that shook only a little, and she gave it to the coachman, and she watched the fine carriage turn and diminish down the lane and vanish where the road bent toward the north. Then she went back into the cold little house that had been the last of her father's failing, and sat down at her mother's pianoforte and played, because she did not know what else to do with the feeling that was in her, which was too large and too frightening to name. She did not cry. She had not cried at the funeral, and she had not cried at the sale of the house, and she did not cry now, on the edge of the first good fortune she had known in years, because she had made a compact with herself long ago that tears were a coin she would not spend cheaply, and she meant to keep it. But her hands, on the keys, said everything her eyes would not. She had expected to be received by the housekeeper. She had not expected the Duke. Renmore House rose out of the winter fields like something that had been carved rather than built. grey stone under a grey sky, tall and cold and beautiful in the way that a cliff is beautiful, which is to say, without any wish to be. The carriage that had been sent for her carried her up a long avenue of bare limes and set her down before a door large enough to admit a coach, and a butler, with a face like a folded napkin, conducted her through halls where her footsteps were the only sound, past furniture shrouded in Holland cloth, past portraits of dead men who all had the same dark, unhappy eyes, and into a library where a fire burned but did not seem to warm anything, and there, standing at the window with his back to the room, was a man she knew at once to be the master of the house, because the house was in his shoulders. He did not turn when she was announced. He let the silence sit, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, as though testing whether she would fill it with the nervous chatter that lesser applicants no doubt supplied. And Eleanor, who had learned in a hard school that silence costs nothing and reveals less, folded her hands and waited, and said not a word. When at last he turned, she saw that the Duke of Renmore was younger than the house had led her to expect, perhaps 35, tall and spare, with black hair going grey at the temples before its time, and a face that might have been called handsome if it had not so plainly forbidden the description. It was a closed face, guarded and precise, with a hard mouth and eyes the colour of the winter sky outside, and it looked at her the way a man looks at an account he suspects will not balance. He asked her few questions, and he asked them coldly. Whether she could teach a child who did not wish to learn, whether she was given to fancies, to sentiment, to the tears and vapours he seemed to expect of women, whether she understood that his ward was not an ordinary child and would not be treated as a spectacle or a project or a means to the instructress's own advancement. Eleanor answered plainly and briefly and without heat. She said she could teach any child who would sit still long enough to be taught, and some who would not. She said she had wept over nothing in the past 3 years, that a fire and a full plate would not cure, and she did not expect to begin now. And she said, meeting his cold eyes with her grey ones and not looking away, that she had come to be of use to a child, not to his grace, and that if the two purposes ever came into conflict, she hoped he would forgive her for choosing the child. Something moved then in that shuttered face. Not surprise, quite, not approval, but a flicker, the barest recalibration, the look of a man who has laid a trap for a certain kind of person and caught a different kind entirely. He was silent again, longer this time, and Eleanor let him be silent, and at last he named his terms. She would have the position, she would have a good room and a fire in it, and her meals as she preferred, in the schoolroom or the small parlour as she liked. She would be paid the sum named in the letter, and paid it promptly. In return, she would give the child every hour the child required, and she would not, under any circumstances, encourage in Miss Sophia hopes or affections or attachments that the child's situation could not sustain, and she would remember at all times that she was in the Duke's employ and not in his family, and that the distance between those two conditions was fixed and would not alter. He said this last, with a particular flat finality, as a man recites a lesson he has learned at cost, and Eleanor understood, without being told, that he was warning her away from something he had seen happen before, some earlier softness that had gone wrong. She did not resent it. She agreed to all of it, but she added, quietly, one term of her own, because she had learned that a person who accepts everything is soon treated as nothing, and she meant from the first to be treated as something, however small. She said that she would keep her mother's pianoforte in her room, that it had come with her in the carriage wrapped in blankets, and that she would trouble no one for its keeping, and that she asked only to be permitted to play it, in her own hours, when her work was done, for it was the one thing of her own she had left, and she would not give it up, even for so fine a position as this. The Duke regarded her for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that gave nothing away, that she might play what she liked, when she liked, so long as the house did not hear it, and that he trusted the house was large enough to swallow the sound. And so the transaction was made, cold and clear on both sides, an arrangement of use and payment, with no warmth in it anywhere, and Eleanor Hale, who had bargained her one small dignity out of a man who had meant to grant her none, took up her plain grey life in the great grey house, and did not yet know that she had made, in that library, the first small crack in a wall that had stood for years. The house did not welcome her, because the house had forgotten how. Wrenmore was a place in mourning for itself, and it wore its grief in the shuttered windows of its unused rooms, in the cloths thrown over its finest furniture, in the great dining table that could seat 40 and was never laid for more than 2, in the long galleries where the clocks were kept wound, but where no one walked. Eleanor learned its geography slowly, as one learns the moods of a difficult person, and she came to feel that the house was less a building than a held breath, waiting for something that did not come. The servants were civil and no more. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, was a spare, upright woman who ran the establishment with the grim efficiency of a garrison holding a fortress no one was besieging, and she watched Eleanor at first with open suspicion, as though a music instructress from a small town might at any moment reveal herself to be a thief or a schemer, or worse, a woman with designs. Coon the butler unbent not at all. The footmen looked through her, as they had been trained to look through everyone below a certain rank, and the maids whispered, and Eleanor bore it all with the same steady patience she had brought to everything else, because she had been an outsider before, and she knew that the only cure for it was time and usefulness, both of which she had in abundance. But the child was the thing. On her first morning, Eleanor was brought to the schoolroom, a cold, high chamber at the top of the east wing, and there, in a chair by the window that was too large for her, sat Miss Sophia, Duke's ward, orphaned niece, 7 years old, and the sight of her stopped Eleanor in the doorway and put a hand around her heart and squeezed. The child was small and neat and perfectly still. She had dark hair like her uncle's, and a pale, pointed face, and enormous dark eyes that turned to Eleanor when she entered, and then turned away again, back to the window, back to the grey fields, with the terrible, incurious patience of a creature that has stopped expecting anything from the opening of doors. She did not speak. Eleanor learned, from Mrs. Price, in a rare, unbending moment, that the child had not spoken more than a handful of words in over a year, not since the accident that had taken her mother and father both, the Duke's sister and her husband, drowned when their carriage went off a flooded bridge on a black autumn night, and that the physicians had been consulted and had shaken their heads and named the condition with Latin words that meant, when translated, that they did not know, and that the child ate what was put before her, and slept when she was put to bed, and sat where she was set down, and had, in the judgment of the household, simply gone somewhere inside herself, where no one could follow. The Duke, Mrs. Price did not say, but Eleanor understood, could not bear it. He loved the child, in his sealed and wordless way, and he could not look at her, because to look at her was to see his sister's eyes in a face that had stopped speaking, and so he kept to his own wing and his own affairs, and left the raising of his ward to housekeepers and nurses, and now to a music instructress from a town he had never visited, and paid handsomely for the privilege of not being asked to feel. Eleanor did not push the child. That was her first decision, and it was the right one. She did not fill the silence with bright false chatter, did not coax or wheedle, or perform the anxious cheerfulness that the child had no doubt been subjected to by a dozen well-meaning adults. Instead, she simply came, each morning, and she sat, and she was quietly present, and she began, gently, to make the cold schoolroom into a place a person might want to be. She brought her own small store of ribbons, and drew pictures, and left them where the child could find them. She read aloud, not to Sophia particularly, but into the room, stories with slow, kind rhythms, and she did not look to see whether the child listened, though she saw, from the corner of her eye, that the child's stillness sometimes changed its quality, became a listening stillness, rather than an absent one. She learned the child's habits, the way she liked the curtain drawn just so, the way she hoarded certain small objects, a smooth stone, a blue button, a broken watch chain, in the pocket of her pinafore. And on the 4th day, when the light was failing, and the fire was low, and the great cold house held its breath around them. Eleanor sat down at the schoolroom's neglected old spinet, out of tune and stiff with disuse, and she played, softly, one of her mother's slow airs, not for the child, or so she told herself, only for the pleasure of a little music, in a silent room, and she felt, rather than saw, the small, still figure by the window turn its enormous dark eyes toward the sound, and hold there, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, before turning away again. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first door. Winter softened into a wet, reluctant spring, and Eleanor's quiet conquest of Renmore went on so gradually that no one in the house could have named the day it began, or the day it succeeded, only that at some point the fortress had opened its gates without anyone recalling the order to do so. It began with the child, as everything of value in that house began with the child. Eleanor did not try to make Sophia speak, and perhaps that was why. One grey morning, the child spoke. Eleanor had been playing the old spinet, having coaxed a tuner up from the nearest town at her own expense, and she had made a small mistake, a wrong note in a passage she knew perfectly, and she had said aloud, lightly, to no one, "Oh dear," and a small clear voice from the window seat had said, "You did it wrong," and Eleanor had gone very still, and had not turned around, and had said, just as lightly, "So I did. Will you show me?" And the child had come, on soundless feet, and had put one small finger on the right key, and pressed it, and that was all, and it was a beginning that changed everything. After that the words came slowly, a trickle, and then a stream, and Eleanor guarded the secret of them jealously, not because she wished to hoard the child's affection, but because she understood that a thing so newly born must be sheltered from too much light, and she said nothing to the household, and let Sophia find her own voice in her own time. The child took to the pianoforte the way a parched thing takes to water. She had a true ear and small, clever hands, and a hunger for the one thing that had reached her in her long silence, and Eleanor taught her as her own mother had taught her, patiently, letting the silences matter, and the schoolroom that had been a cell became, by slow degrees, a warm place full of music and low talk, and, at last, on a day Eleanor marked forever in her heart, the sound of a child laughing. The house heard it. That was the thing Eleanor had not reckoned on. The servants heard the laughter and the music, and the two voices where there had been one silence, and something in the great held breath of Renmore began, very slowly, to let go. Mrs. Price found reasons to pass by the schoolroom, and then reasons to linger, and then, one afternoon, brought up a plate of seed cakes without being asked, and said gruffly that the child looked to have got some colour, and went away again before Eleanor could thank her. Coombe, the butler, began to say good morning. The maids stopped whispering and started smiling, and the footman named Thomas, who was young and had a kind, foolish face, took to carrying up coal for the schoolroom fire, without being told, and building it higher than his instructions strictly allowed. Eleanor unshuttered a room. It was a small liberty, and she took it carefully, a little sitting room off the schoolroom that had been closed up for years, and she asked Mrs. Price's leave, and Mrs. Price gave it with a sniff that was not quite refusal, and Eleanor took down the holland cloths and opened the shutters, and let the grey spring light into a space that had not seen it in an age, and she and the child cleaned it themselves, laughing, sneezing at the dust, and made of it a bright small kingdom of their own. The house came alive one room at a time, and the coming alive of the rooms was the coming alive of something larger, and Eleanor felt it and did not name it, and worked on, patient and unshowy, with small good things and letting them accumulate the way snow accumulates, each flake nothing, the whole of it enough to change the shape of the world. We will pause here just a moment, and if these slow, quiet stories are the kind you like to sink into, do consider subscribing to the channel, so the next one finds its way to you. Now, the child. There came an evening when Sophia, tucked into her bed with her smooth stone, and her blue button, and her broken watch chain arranged on the coverlet in the particular order she required, caught Eleanor's hand as she rose to go, and held it, and said, in the small voice that still came out only for Eleanor, "Will you stay until I am asleep?" And Eleanor sat back down, and stayed, and understood that she had been given something she had not been hired for, and could not be paid for, and would break her heart to lose. She thought of the Duke's warning, that she must not encourage in the child affections her situation could not sustain, and she knew she had already disobeyed it beyond any hope of repair, because you cannot pour warmth into a cold child and expect the child not to love the source of the warmth, and you cannot love a child, as Eleanor now helplessly did, and pretend that you are only her employee. She had crossed a line she had been told not to cross, and she did not regret it, and she resolved to bear whatever the crossing cost her, because some things are worth their cost, and a child learning to laugh again is one of them. She did not know that the Duke, returned unremarked from one of his frequent absences, had passed the schoolroom door that very evening, and heard, through it, the sound of his ward's voice, speaking, and had stood a long time in the dark corridor with his hand against the cold wall, and had not gone in, because he did not trust himself to be seen with his face as it was. It happened on an evening in early April, when the Duke was believed to be in London, and was not. He had gone up on business 3 days before, some matter of estates and lawyers that had been meant to keep him a fortnight, and it had concluded, unexpectedly, in an afternoon, and he had ordered his horse rather than wait for the carriage, and had ridden the 40 miles alone through a thawing dusk, because he could not have said, if anyone had asked him, why he was in such haste to reach a house he could hardly bear to inhabit. He came in by a side door, wet to the knee and grey with fatigue, and the house that received him was dark and quiet as he expected it to be, the servants at their supper below, the child long abed, and he moved through the familiar cold rooms toward his own wing, thinking of nothing but a fire and the removal of his boots. And then he stopped, because he heard music. He thought at first that he had imagined it. Renmore did not make music. Renmore had not made music in years, not since the great pianoforte in the long drawing-room had been closed and locked after his sister went away to be married, and never truly came back. But the sound was real, and it came from the long drawing-room, and it was not the schoolroom spinet with its thin, apologetic voice. It was the great instrument itself, opened, awake, singing under hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Eleanor had believed the house empty. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. She had put the child to bed, and the servants were below, and the master was in London for a fortnight, and the long drawing-room with its magnificent silent pianoforte had been calling to her for weeks, and on this one evening, alone in a house she thought held no one who could hear, she had given in. She had lit a single candle and lifted the lid and found the instrument miraculously near in tune, as though it had only been sleeping, and she had sat down and begun to play, softly at first, and then not softly, her mother's slow airs, and then the grander things she never played for anyone, the pieces that asked too much and gave too much, and she had let herself, for once, be entirely and only what she was, which was not a servant, and not a plain grey woman of no fortune, but an artist, wholly alive, pouring out through her hands everything she never let show in her face. She did not hear him come. She played with her eyes half closed, and her whole self bent toward the sound, and the Duke stood in the dark doorway, with his wet coat still on, and his heart doing something it had not done in longer than he could remember, and he watched her, and he listened, and he did not move, because to move would have been to end it. The candlelight was on her plain face, and her plain grey dress, and her clever moving hands, and she was, in that moment, in the private country of the music, where she believed no one could see her, entirely beautiful, and the Duke of Renmore, who had trained himself for years to feel as little as a man can feel, and go on living, felt the wall he had built around himself take the first blow it had taken since the night the bridge gave way. For the music she was playing was the music of grief, and it was the exact grief he carried, the grief he had never once let out of the locked room where he kept it. And here was this woman he had hired and warned and held at a fixed cold distance, playing it into the air of his own house, as though she had reached into his chest and found it and given it a voice. He made some sound. He never knew what, a breath, a movement, the creak of a wet boot, but Eleanor's hands came down on a discord and stopped, and she turned and saw him, and the blood went out of her face and then came back into it all at once, and she rose, upsetting the stool, and began to say that she was sorry, that she had believed the house empty, that he had said she might play only where the house could not hear, that she would go at once and would not touch it again. And the Duke, who had meant to say something cold, who had every intention as he crossed the threshold of reminding her of the terms of her employment and the distance that was fixed and would not alter, found that he could not say any of it, because his throat had closed, and what came out instead, low and rough and unlike his own voice, was the single word, "Do not." "Do not stop." He said it again, more quietly. "Do not stop." And he came into the room, and he sat down, not near her, in a chair by the cold hearth, and he said, looking at the floor and not at her, that his sister had played that she had played that very piece, on that very instrument, and that he had not heard it since, and that he had thought he never wished to hear it again, and had been wrong. And Eleanor, who understood a great deal about grief, and about the things people cannot say, did not answer him with words. She righted the stool, and sat, and after a moment she began again, softly, the same piece, from the beginning, and she played it for him, this cold, guarded man in his wet coat by his dead fire, played it the way her mother had taught her, letting the silences matter, and the Duke of Renmore put his hand over his eyes, and sat in the candlelight and, for the first time since a black night on a flooded bridge, let himself grieve, while a plain grey woman, he had never meant to notice at all, gave his sorrow back to him as something he could at last bear to hold. After that night, the distance that was fixed and would not alter began, quietly, to alter. It did not announce itself. There was no scene, no declaration, nothing that either of them would have been able to point to and call a change, and yet the change was everywhere, in the small adjustments of a house rearranging itself around a new possibility. The Duke came home more often, and stayed longer, and his absences grew short, and his presences grew easy. He began to take his dinner in the small parlour, rather than alone at the vast table, and Eleanor and the child dined with him, at first by a stiff and careful invitation, and then by simple habit, and the great table that could seat 40 was left to its cloths, and the small table that seated 3 became the living heart of the house. He learned to speak to his ward again. It was the hardest thing he did, and Eleanor watched him do it with an ache in her throat, watched this formidable man lower himself with infinite awkward care into the world of a 7-year-old, learn the names of her smooth stone and her blue button, submit to being taught, badly, at the pianoforte by a child who corrected his fingering with imperious delight, and she watched Sophia, who had lost a father, find in her uncle something she had thought gone forever. And Eleanor understood that she was witnessing 2 people save each other, and that she had, somehow, without meaning to, been the road by which they found their way back. The Duke and Eleanor talked, now, in the evenings, after the child was abed. They talked by the fire, in the long drawing room, with the pianoforte open between them, like a third presence, and Eleanor learned the man behind the closed face, by slow degrees. She learned that the coldness had been grief, and the grief had been guilt, that the sister who drowned had quarreled with him before she went, over her marriage, which he had opposed, and that the last words between them had been hard ones, and that he had carried, ever since, the unbearable weight of a reconciliation that death had made impossible, and that he had sealed himself off from all feeling, because feeling, for him, had become synonymous with that one wound he could not survive touching. And Eleanor, in return, told him things she had told no one, about her father's slow ruin, and her mother's death, and the cold years of turning her one grey dress twice, and the 2 of them, the Duke and the instructress, sat in the firelight, and gave each other the truths they had guarded, and the giving was its own kind of intimacy, deeper than any touch. She discovered his hidden goodness by accident, as one always does, because a goodness that announces itself is not the real thing. She learned that the smooth stone Sophia hoarded had been given to the child by a stable boy named Tom, and she learned, following the thread of it, that the Duke paid for that boy's mother's cottage, and had done for years, quietly, through the steward, letting no one know, and that this was only one of 100 such quiet accountings. Tenants whose rents were forgiven in bad years, an old blind groom pensioned in comfort, a village school kept open out of the Duke's own purse, under another man's name, and that the cold, hard master of Renmore, whom the county thought proud and unfeeling, was in fact the most privately generous man in it, and cared nothing at all for the credit, and would have been embarrassed past bearing to be thanked. Eleanor said nothing to him of what she had found, but she looked at him differently after, and he felt the difference in her looking, and something eased further open in him, because to be seen truly, by someone who expects nothing from the seeing, is a thing few of us are ever granted. The almost came often now. Eleanor had learned to read his sealed face, and she had found in it a single tell, a small movement at the corner of his hard mouth, when something touched him that he would not let touch his eyes. Not quite a smile, a near thing, the almost, and she collected these almosts the way a poor woman collects small coins, and counted them over in secret, and hoped, though she told herself sternly that she must not hope, because a duke did not marry a music instructress, and the distance that had altered so far could not alter all the way, and she would be a fool to imagine it could. She was not a fool. She reminded herself often that she was not a fool. She reminded herself that she was 24 and plain and portionless, and in his employ, that whatever warmth had grown between them was the warmth of grief shared, and a child healed, and could not be more, and that when this strange, bright interval ended, as all intervals end, she would go back to being what she was, and that she must take care not to let her heart grow so large in the meantime that there would be no folding it small again. She reminded herself of all this, sensibly, nightly, and every evening she went down to the fire, and the open pianoforte and the guarded man, growing less guarded, and every evening the reminding did less good, and she knew it, and she went anyway, because a candle in a wind is still a light, and she had been cold for so very long. Into this fragile spring came Lady Cordelia Marsh, and she came the way frost comes to blossom, beautiful and killing. She was a widow of large fortune and larger ambition, some connection of the Duke's late mother, and she had decided, in the cool, calculating way she decided everything, that she would be the next Duchess of Renmore, and she had been laying her siege to that end for above a year, with the patience of a woman who has never in her life been refused what she truly wanted. She was, everyone agreed, the most beautiful woman in the county, tall and golden, and dressed always in the first stare of fashion, and she knew the exact worth of her own beauty to the last farthing, and spent it like the shrewd investor she was. She descended upon Renmore for a fortnight's visit that she plainly intended to make permanent, with a maid and a mountain of trunks, and a manner of sweet steel, and within an hour of her arrival, she had taken the measure of the household and found in it something that did not please her, and the something was Eleanor. She saw at once what the servants had grown too accustomed to see. She saw the Duke's eyes go to the instructress across a room. She saw the child run to the plain grey woman, and not to her. She saw the small table set for 3, and understood everything it meant, and she smiled, and was charming, and began, at once and very quietly, to destroy it. Her methods were exquisite. She never raised her voice, and never said an unkind word that could be repeated against her. She merely, in 100 small ways, put Eleanor in her place, and kept her there. She addressed her, as one addresses a servant, with a bright, dismissive courtesy that was worse than rudeness. She contrived that Eleanor should dine below, or not dine in company at all, murmuring to the Duke that surely the instructress would be more comfortable, that it was awkward for the poor creature to be raised above her station, that people would talk. She praised Eleanor's usefulness, in the tone one uses for a good plain cook, and she watched. always, with her lovely cold eyes, for the moment to strike a blow that would end the thing entirely, and Eleanor, who saw exactly what was being done to her and could do nothing, bore it with a rigid grey dignity that only made Lady Cordelia hate her the more, because there is nothing a cruel person despises like a victim who will not be seen to bleed. The Duke was slow to understand. Men often are, in these matters, and he had spent so many years insensible to the currents of feeling in his own house that he was out of the habit of reading them. He saw only that Eleanor had grown quiet again and withdrawn, and that the ease between them had cooled, and he did not at first see the hand that was cooling it, because Lady Cordelia was careful never to let him see it. But the child saw. Sophia, who had learned to speak again, and had learned it from Eleanor, and loved her past all reason, watched the golden woman push her beloved instructress into corners and out of rooms, and grew fretful and silent, and began to hoard her small objects again, with the anxious intensity of the bad old days. And the Duke, who had learned at last to read his ward, saw the child retreating, and traced the retreat to its source. And still Lady Cordelia might have won, for slander is a patient art, and she had time, had she not, in the end, overreached, as the vain and cruel always do, because they cannot imagine that anyone sees them clearly, and so they grow careless in their certainty of triumph. The occasion was a great dinner, the largest the house had held in years, given ostensibly to honor Lady Cordelia and attended by the whole neighborhood, and Lady Cordelia, secure in her golden certainty, chose it as the setting for her killing stroke. Before the assembled company, over the soup, in a voice pitched to carry, she turned the conversation with silken skill to the subject of the instructress, and she let fall, with wide, innocent eyes, a story. She said she had heard, though of course she could not vouch for it, that Miss Hale had left her last position under a cloud, that there had been talk, that a young gentleman of the family had been involved, that the girl had been sent away, that one could not be too careful whom one admitted to one's household, particularly where an impressionable child was concerned, and particularly, she added with a small, significant smile, where a gentleman of the house might be exposed to the arts of a designing woman who had learned that a helpless air and a plain grey dress were as effective a lure as any. It was a masterpiece of its kind. Every word of it was a lie, and every word of it was unanswerable, framed as rumor, deniable, poisonous, and it fell into the crowded, candle-lit room and spread its stain across the white cloth, and the guests went still and turned their eyes to Eleanor, who had been permitted to the table that night only because Lady Cordelia had willed it so, the better to destroy her in company, and Eleanor sat with her fork halfway to her lips and felt the whole bright room turn cold, and knew, with the clear resignation of a woman who has been poor and powerless all her life, that she had lost, and that there was nothing, nothing at all, that she could say. Into that ringing, poisoned silence, before the Duke could speak, before Eleanor could rise and flee, a voice cracked out from the foot of the table, like a dry stick breaking, and it belonged to Lady Augusta. The Duke's great-aunt had come for the dinner, a formidable old woman, in unrelieved black, with a lorgnette, and a face like a closed door. The same old woman who had sat at the back of a small town's assembly rooms one grey afternoon, and heard a music instructress play, and said not a word, and she had been watching the golden Lady Cordelia across the candlelight all evening, with the flat, unblinking attention of a hawk, observing a stoat. And now she lowered her lorgnette and said, into the frozen room, that she found it remarkable, truly remarkable, how much a certain sort of person could claim to have heard about a girl she had known for a fortnight, and how little, in a lifetime of hearing things, she herself had ever heard to the credit of a certain sort of person. And she let that sit, and picked up her spoon, and added, mildly, to her soup, that she had been the one to recommend Miss Hale to the household, having heard her play, and having, unlike some, a tolerable ear for the difference between a true thing and a false one, and that she would take it as a personal affront, at her age, to be told she had been deceived by a girl in a grey dress, when she had spent 70 years being lied to by women in gold ones, and had grown, she flattered herself, rather good at telling them apart. There was a sound around the table that might, in a less well-bred company, have been a laugh. Lady Cordelia's beautiful face did something it was not accustomed to doing. And then the Duke stood up. He did not stand quickly, or angrily, or with any of the heat the moment seemed to call for. He rose slowly, to his full height, and the room went silent in a different way, the way a room goes silent when the person who owns it means to be heard, and he looked down the length of the great table, past the golden woman and the shocked guests, to where Eleanor sat frozen, in her plain grey dress, with the whole county's eyes upon her, and he began to speak, and his voice was low and even, and carried into every corner of that vast candle-lit room. He said that he would say a thing once, in company, so that it need never be said again, and that the county might carry it home and make of it what it liked. He said that when this house had been a tomb, and his ward a silent ghost within it, and himself a man who had forgotten the use of his own heart, one person had come into it, asking for nothing, promised nothing, and had, by patience and kindness and quiet unshowy work, brought the dead house back to life. He said that the child at the top of the east wing spoke again, and laughed again, and slept without weeping, and that there was one person in the world to thank for it, and that she was sitting at his table in a grey dress being slandered by a woman who had never, in her gilded life, done a single kind thing that did not profit her. He said that he had been warned, long ago, against letting anyone matter, and that he had heeded the warning for years, to his own great impoverishment, and that he had lately unlearned it, and that he found he would rather feel everything and lose it than feel nothing and keep it safe. And then he said, looking only at Eleanor now, as though the crowded room had emptied and held only the two of them, that he had not chosen her for her fortune, for she had none, and he had not chosen her for her beauty, though she was to him the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and he had not chosen her for her station, for the world would say she had none of that either. He had chosen her, he said, because she had walked into the coldest house in England, and had not been afraid of it, because she had bargained a pianoforte out of a man who meant to give her nothing, because she had loved a broken child freely when she had been forbidden to love it at all, and because she had seen him, truly seen him, the man behind the closed door, when he had spent years making certain no one could. And Eleanor, who had not wept at her father's funeral, or at the sale of her house, or in all the long cold years of turning one grey dress twice, felt something break open in her at last, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and she wept, there at the great table before the whole county. And she was not ashamed of it, because these were the other kind of tears, the kind she had saved her whole life without knowing she was saving them. Lady Cordelia Marsh left Renmore before morning, and the county talked of the golden widow's disgrace for a season, and then forgot her, as the world forgets the vain, completely and without regret. But that night, when the guests were gone and the candles burning low, the Duke found Eleanor in the long drawing-room by the open pianoforte, and he crossed to her, and he took her ink-stained clever hands in his, and he told her his name, his given name, the name no one had used since his sister died, and he asked her, quietly, whether she would consent to use it. And Eleanor, whose own name he then spoke as though it were the most precious word in the language, said that she would, and the almost, at the corner of his hard mouth became, at last, after all the long cold months of nearly, a true and whole and unguarded smile, and she thought she had never seen anything so beautiful, and she was right. 1 year later, spring came to Renmore, as it had always meant to, and this time the house was ready for it. The Holland cloths were gone from the furniture and folded away in the attics, and the shuttered rooms stood open to the light, one after another, down the long galleries, so that a person walking through the house walked through room after room of sun. The great table that could seat 40 was laid, that spring, for a christening, for there was a new small life at Renmore now, a dark-eyed infant who slept, more often than not, to the sound of the pianoforte, because the pianoforte was never silent anymore. The garden that had gone to ruin was a garden again, dug and planted through the previous summer under Eleanor's patient direction, and it flowered now, in its first full season, and Sophia, 9 years old and grown tall, ran through it with the stable boy's smooth stone still in her pocket, and her laughter carrying up to the open windows of a house that had learned, at long last, how to hold the sound of joy. Eleanor stood at one of those windows on the morning of the christening and looked out over the garden and the fields beyond, and she was dressed, that day, not in the plain grey wool she had turned twice and worn out, but in a gown of soft dove-grey silk, the colour she had always chosen, kept because it was hers, transformed because she was seen. She had not, in the end, given up the grey. The grey had been dignity, when dignity was all she had, and she wore it still, now that she had so much more, because a person should not be ashamed of the colour they wore when they had nothing, and because her husband had told her, the first time he saw her in the silver silk, that he had loved her first in grey, and would love her last in it, and that she must never wear any colour that made her less herself. The house itself had been reborn, room by room across that year, and Eleanor had overseen the reviving of it, the way she did all things, quietly and without display, taking down one set of shrouds at a time, unlocking one long silent chamber, and then the next, until the great grey fortress, that had been a held breath, became a home that exhaled. The library where she had first met her husband, standing cold at the window with the whole weight of the house in his shoulders, was warm now, and used, its fire lit every evening, its shelves dusted and open, and the child did her lessons there, and the servants no longer moved through it as though past a sickbed. Mrs. Price, who had watched the instructress arrive with the suspicion of a garrison, ran the christening breakfast that morning with a fierce proprietary joy, and had wept, privately, in the still room, over the cutting of the cake, and would have died before admitting it. Coombe the butler had unbent so far as to smile openly, and young Thomas the footman built every fire in the house higher than his instructions strictly allowed, and no one corrected him any more. Lady Augusta had come for the christening, of course formidable and black and sharp as ever, and she had looked around the transformed house through her lorgnette and pronounced, to no one in particular, that she supposed she would now have to endure a great deal of tiresome happiness whenever she visited, and that she found she could bear it, and had then demanded the best chair by the fire and taken the new infant onto her bony lap with an expression of ferocious tenderness that dared anyone to remark upon it. Behind Eleanor now, in the room, she heard her husband come in, and she heard him cross to her, and she felt him stand at her shoulder and look out with her at the garden, and the running child, and the good, bright, ordinary morning, and neither of them spoke for a while, because they had both learned, long ago, and from each other, that the silences between things could matter as much as the things themselves. Then he said, quietly, that it was a strange business, when he considered it, that all of this, the open rooms and the laughing child, and the christening, and the woman he could not now imagine his life without, had begun as nothing more than a cold arrangement, a transaction, a servant hired, and a wage agreed. And Eleanor turned from the window and looked at the man whose given name she now used every day as easily as breathing, and she told him that he was wrong, that it had never been a transaction, that a transaction was a thing that ended when the debt was paid, and that what they had was a thing that would never be paid off and never end, and that it had not been a bargain at all, in the end, but a life. And he smiled at that, the true, whole, unguarded smile that she had waited a winter to earn, and would never tire of earning again. And downstairs, the bells began to ring for the christening, and the house that had once held its breath let it out, and went on breathing, warm and open and full of light, for all the good years that were still to come. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its quiet end. If it warmed a cold evening for you, or brought a tear you did not expect, tell us in the comments which city you are listening from and what the story left behind in you. And if you would like the next slow story to find you when it comes, do subscribe, and we will keep them coming, one gentle winter into one gentle spring at a time.